Yeah, I'm just gonna check. Julia, can you hear us online?
Yes, I can hear
Ah,
everything.
perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Ainhoa. You know, I'm the Vice President for Communities at the Students' Union. And this is our fifth and last climate assembly of the semester. So it's quite sad, but we got a beautiful and super interesting topic here, biodiversity and climate change today. So I'll just do the basic housekeeping. You all know everything by heart by now. But we got some food here. I mean, for now, we just have the snacks. The food will be arriving later. My colleague Joe is doing the food sharing collection from Pret à manger. I always struggle pronouncing that. If you want to go to the bathroom, I actually suggest going outside to the main building, because otherwise you have to go upstairs, which is not very accessible. But yeah, we don't expect any fire alarms. So if the fire alarm goes on, please just run away. And that's it. I think we'll get going. Well, wait, this is the program for today. Why is it not working? This always happens. There we go. Perfect. So this is the schedule for today. I don't know if you want to take a photo. I mean, there's some printed versions around. And we'll have Eloise Mayal joining us later. We got Martin Mels here already. So yeah, we'll start with a quick activity. If you can scan the QR code and just tell us which actions would you take to tackle climate change, and you have to rank them in order of priority. So I'll just give you like 20 minutes to do that.
Like from just a personal perspective or from more like if you are in government?
No, what would be your priority as an individual? Are you guys also able to see the results of everyone? Okay, that's cool. Okay, well, I'm gonna assume that most of us are done now. So yeah, we can move on to the next activity. Timmy, do you want to say anything? Oh, sorry.
I think I like the results that we came up with because it kind of like I think first and 10th were exactly the same for me as I think a couple people. Where I think first is adopt a more sustainable lifestyle, and then 10th is like email politicians. I think yeah, with when it comes to me and anything with like sustainability, I'd more love to be on the practical side of it rather than sides that don't involve me doing anything or change anything. So I think email politicians, as much as getting them involved in the conversation is good, I think taking steps yourself where then people recognize what you're doing and then they get influence is always better than just emailing someone and then you don't really know where it's going to go, but rather you have your own motives and you're doing something rather than putting into the hands of someone else. So I kind of like that. Those were the first and 10th options.
I think that's a really good point, actually. And I mean, it kind of shows like the kind of group that you guys are. Like, you're here because you want to make a difference, right? So that's probably why, as you're saying, like the activities where you are involved firsthand are ranked higher than the other ones, like signing petitions, boycotting, or emailing politicians.
Personally, I think that like doing these like conservation activities and the more practical activities go hand in hand with taking on leadership roles, because while the I mean, yeah, like with a lot of politicians, you may email them and they won't really do much in response to that. Taking on a leadership role means that you increase the pool of politicians who will actually do something about climate change, and yes, taking the more practical action would mean that you sort of have more of an idea of what you about what you're doing, and you're able to motivate the people you're working with if you've managed to get a scheme up and running to actually tackle it, but you need a broader base of support.
Can I just be slightly controversial and pretend to counter? I do think practical stuff is very important as well. And, you know, emailing and petitioning were not at the top of my list either. But I still think it is very important to be reaching out and getting involved in local politics as well and be emailing people, because even if they don't respond, you can keep emailing. And it's just bringing more attention to the people that actually do it. A lot of the time when people do their individual actions, they're very, very important, but they don't gain any traction. If you try and like engage with petitions have changed things, big things. You know, to make grand change, you have to do things on a grand scale. And a lot of the time that is things like online petitions, or lots of people calling or like their MPs and things like that. That's how things get talked about in, you know, the House of Commons, and that's how it works. So yeah, very important to do things on your own, but you shouldn't try and diminish, I think, just reaching out to the people that are in a position already as well, because it takes a long time for you to get to that position yourself.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess it's also important to, as you're saying, like directly contact email, even if you don't get any response higher ups, because after all, like change most of the times comes from the top. So we need to drive a top-down control. I guess us as individuals, we can also contribute from a bottom-up approach, but it's important to do both activities.
No, sorry. I have to agree with that about how, if I had to rank them, I'm glad that individual change is at the top, but I do disagree that emailing politicians should be at the bottom because, as you've mentioned, petitions have changed something. But very frequently about community networking on a global scale, you'll need about a few million signatures for a petition to mean anything. A few 100,000 isn't much to a government. However, your representatives are intended to represent you, and they're not going to unless you engage with them directly. A relative percentage of politicians who you could say don't particularly represent the interests of their constituents haven't really got much contact with the people who are actually asking for change because they assume that a single voice can't do much. But that means that not many people do reach out to politicians directly. So I would agree that harassing politicians is the best you can do as an individual rather than petitions. Oh, sorry.
No, this one just doesn't work. Right, okay. There's a really big advantage to living in Scotland, okay, for this kind of thing, which is that the Scottish Parliament contains within it publicly accessible cross-party groups. Now, it's really important to understand that cross-party groups, there are 103 in the Scottish Parliament. They cover a wide variety of areas, everywhere from the cross-party group on Tibet, for example, through to the cross-party group on beer, and via quite a wide range of things from multiple sclerosis all the way through to a variety that are on the climate change issues and all of those things. They are attended by MSPs. They have the capacity to invite foreign politicians and a variety of others and leaders. They are a really good leverage, and all you need to do is walk in. Okay, it's important to understand this. It's actually one of the most agential systems I've ever seen, especially in comparison with the Westminster system, which is the all-party group, by which you kind of need an invite to and everything on those lines. Whereas all you need to do with the Scottish parliamentary system is go and look on their website. You can do that right now. Go and look on their website, find out who the secretary is, and say, and look for when their meeting is, and say, I am coming. And you turn up. You get searched at the Parliament, and at some point they give you a little badge with a GV, which means general visitor on it, and you get taken to one of their seminar rooms, and that's where you sit down and have your meetings. I, as a junior lecturer, for example, in 2007, I think it was, walked in, and they were like, it was a cross-party group on Tibet, and I'm a Tibet specialist, so that's a good thing. And I walked in, and there were 4 of them looking rather depressed. And I said, fine. Go to the second meeting. On the second meeting, say, you know, we could really help you from a university perspective. And they were like, great, you want to be our secretary? Because we usually like having students as our secretaries. And I went, no, I want to be your briefings officer and your research officer. And they were like, oh, can you find a student? We were like, great. And so we actually kind of did that. Started writing briefing papers for them that were based on university level research, all of which you could gain access to and start writing. Okay, or you could come in and say you want to do secretarial duties, or you simply turn up and make your voice, because you are talking to these people that close, okay, and you start running it, and then you use that to go to other things, to do other things. You know, it's a really good springboard. It's great. You know, within a little while, I was secretary of the cross-party group on Tibet, which allowed me to end up fighting with the Chinese embassy and invite the Tibetan prime minister to Scotland. It was one of the major reasons why Pemba Tsering, the exiled Tibetan prime minister, came up and spoke here 2 years ago. You know, this is a really, really easy thing to do. It's an incredibly easy win. It also teaches you politics, if that's your kind of thing. But the real thing is you can get the voice in there and the agency in there, not at the end of an email, but really kind of face to face. And then you just go, well, what other cross-party groups do I need to go to help here? The Scottish system is one of the best in the world. Use it. Okay? All you have to do, and you get a data.
That's really good to know. I had no idea. Yeah.
You can use them to kind of push people to set up exhibitions.
I was gonna say, I think, I don't know, I can't remember how far it was ranked, but petitions can be really useful because sometimes, if you get a certain number of signatures, it can stall a really harmful action. And sometimes, like, I don't know how it is in some. I know in the U.S., like sometimes if you get like the government will put petitions or like times where you can like open for comments, and if you do that, if they get enough responses, they do have to stop what they're doing and reevaluate it, which is sometimes that time that it stalls those policies, harmful policies, is really what it needs to
Yeah, I'll just make a final comment and then we'll move on. But yeah, I think honestly, like petitions and also filling in the consultations as well are quite important. I've definitely had meetings with the city council and advocated for something, and they're like, yeah, but no one's filling in the consultations to be able to do these things, because apparently the people that do, most of the people that fill in the consultations are actually those that are against it. So if the city council is looking for people to fill in the consultation to be able to develop a cycling lane on, or like pedestrian lines Union Street, most of the people don't bother filling in consultations. So it's actually those that are really, really, really against it that fill in these consultations. So they never manage to make the progress. So I think filling in the consultations would be quite it is a bit of a pain, but it does make a difference. Okay, Remy, really quickly.
Although, just to say that it would be probably a good improvement to the system to have an app where you could just answer polls, and that where you could answer polls and then write comments if you wish, since that could be a more accessible way of the consulting people.
Has everyone had a chance to scan it? We're just going to do a quick Mentimeter with some quick questions before we get into some of the talks. Oh, you're on the correct one?
Wait, what? It's not this question. Which one?
Just give us 1 minute, guys. Okay, I think just refresh your screen and we should be on the same track. Let's go back to the QR codes.
To the QR code. There we go. Okay, it's just a different tab.
There you go. Okay, I'm getting quite a good amount of responses. Two. Have you got any time? Oh, you're taking pictures. Okay, perfect. Okay. So everyone's chosen one sort of plant or animal. We've got a really nice mix here. Choose one. Just enjoy yourself, yeah? So everyone picked one. Everyone happy with their choices? There you go. Big up all the elephant people. Me, I like elephants as well. On to the next question. Oh no, okay, yeah, sorry. How do I get up this way?
Let's see what moves this.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There we go. Let's just. There we go.
I think we won the second question already, to be fair.
Okay.
Which one's
that
the
one.
Okay. Next question. Which of the following do you believe possesses the greatest threat to biodiversity? Choose one, yeah. Got a solid mix going on. 7. I think we're missing a couple of people. Climate change. So I think we can all agree that a lot of different things are threats to biodiversity. Next question. Who leads the free tours of the Zoology Museum? So this kind of like a little hint to the next thing that we have available to you guys. And then I'm gonna go ahead and actually tell you guys that it is the Zoology and Biological Sciences Society. What day will that tour be on?
She organized a tour on the 4th of June from 12 to. I mean, the tour is just 1 hour, but I'll explain more later.
Perfect. Next question. How do you feel about climate change and biodiversity loss? Personally, I'd love all. Well, hopefully after today, we should get less people that are hopeless and frustrated. If you need to talk to anybody afterwards to give you some bit of enthusiasm, we have some great guest speakers and we have a lovely VP. So definitely get in touch so we can change your mindset. Which ecosystem do you think is the most important to protect? So again, we have a nice mix happening here, but it just illustrates that we need to be protecting all of them as much as possible and hopefully as fast as we can. Where on campus can you find a rainwater harvesting system for flushing toilets? To be fair, I didn't know this was here as well, so I'm learning something new. Sir Duncan Rice Library. I'm going to look that up afterwards because that sounds amazing. What should the city prioritize for climate action in Aberdeen? Energy transition, species conservation, community resilience, sustainable water management, low carbon transport, campus greening. Fun fact, we've had some assemblies on some of these topics before. So if you missed out, get in touch with Inoa and you can probably get some of our outcomes and videos. Yeah, sustainable water management. There's also an MSc in that as well, if anyone's interested in it. Low carbon transport, community resilience, species conversation, nations. Wonderful. Low carbon transport seems to be the best or one that everyone thinks we should prioritize. Okay. If you could have a green superpower to help the planet, which one would you choose? Choose carefully here, guys. One power only. One. Seems like everybody wants to reverse global warming. Nobody likes recycling. Nobody wants to be talk to animals. Dr. Doolittle. We have one Dr. Doolittle in our midst. Okay, who's a Dr. Doolittle that wants to talk to animals? Be honest, guys. Oh, there we have it. But yeah, reverse global warming. I think that's a very good green superpower to have restoring forests and habitat. Okay.
The thing is that yeah, it's just not economically feasible to replace everything.
That might be a topic for another
Another
assembly.
assembly.
Perfect. Which one would you most be excited to see in the wild? A lynx. You can see the kakapo, rafflesia. I'm not even sure what's rafflesia. Oh, oh, I know of another corpse flower. I'm not sure if there's only one corpse flower, but I think there's a couple that smell really bad. Yeah. Cool. Lynxes. We might be seeing some more lynxes in Scotland soon, legally and illegally. So look forward to that. Green sea turtles, kakapo, rafflesia. But yeah, lynxes coming out on top. I'd love to see a lynx as well. Which building is currently the least energy efficient on campus? Bless you.
I'm sure Shalene, one of our sustainability advocates that has secured an internship with the uni to actually look at these things, he would give us the answer. Oh, that's good to know.
So we'll double check that. Which of these local species is considered a keystone ecosystem engineer? Beaver's coming out in front. And it's absolutely correct. As someone who done civil engineering before I got here, beavers are amazing. Best dam builders in the world. Scottish wildcat, absolutely not. But yeah, European beavers are amazing. Hopefully they start getting reintroduced as well soon. Have you noticed any changes in your local environment? So this is like personal to you. Nice.
She said there's been a few reintroduction schemes for beavers in the UK. Just
thank you very much, guys, for taking part in this Mentimeter. And yeah, we'll carry on with the assembly now.
Thank you, Tim. We're going to move on to the panel discussion now with our guest speakers. So if I can invite our guest speakers to sit here.
Yep, and joining us tonight are Eloise Mayall and Professor Martin Mills. Eloise Mayall is a PhD student in the field of ecology at the University of Aberdeen and is a member of the UK Youth Climate Coalition. She has co-authored studies on climate education and organised the parallel Youth Climate Conference to COP26 in Glasgow. She was also a delegate to the Convention on Biological Diversity and one of the university's COP28 delegates. Professor Martin Mills is a distinguished anthropologist, being the head of anthropology at the University of Aberdeen and I think a personal chair.
I believe so,
Yeah. And he specializes in Himalayan research and has presented a study on global warming in that area to a Scottish Parliament cross-party group.
Hey, hello, I will be moderating this lovely panel discussion and Q&A. So we have about 30 minutes for this panel discussion. So I'll start off with Eloise. How, when, and why did you get involved in climate activism? What inspired you? Oh, we need microphones.
Hello? Oh, I don't need to. Okay, so I suppose, so we'll start. I like science. Which sciences? I liked ecology, went in to study ecology in undergrad. And through joining university and probably finding a lot more like-minded people on my class and also living with new people, that's when I started getting more, I suppose, proactively interested in climate change and biodiversity and how they're interlinked. But at the start, it was very much at the individual action level. So you sort of realize, oh, this is also a time when plastic pollution became like the really big thing on TV. So there's a lot of like zero waste methods. And I went vegan when I was 18 for ethical environmental reasons, minimizing travel, considering where my personal consumption was affecting things. However, as that went on and I started getting more and more particularly focused on individual consumption and individual action, I suppose you could say I was starting to get increasingly dissatisfied with it over time. I think individual action is a wonderfully accessible place to start, and it's often a good place to introduce people into the very confusing world of the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, but it's not a very pleasant place to stay as someone who's interested in trying to make a difference, because your individual action for like a CO2 per gram sort of situation isn't going to do very much. So I was getting more anxious, more hyper-focused on my own individual action, how it was very difficult, I think, for many of us find to try and live sustainably in a system that is very much built on not being sustainable at all. And so from there, I looked into joining something bigger and joining a group and community, because also a level of this anxiety came from not having a group or community who understood or cared quite so much about the issue as I did. So that's when I joined the UK Youth Climate Coalition, which is a 100% volunteer youth group from about 18 to 30 that focuses particularly on getting youth engaged and in making sure other people consider how important youth are in climate crisis, but also ensuring there's a very big climate justice angle, which I found very interesting. I learned a lot through them about understanding how a lot of the issues we have with the climate crisis are going to exacerbate the pre-existing inequalities we often have. So that was really good for my own personal education of how it went. And over time with them, it just built and got bigger. And I did more things. I got speaking opportunities, ended going to COP, ended up talking to negotiators, making educational resources for work. I got into research and particularly eco-anxiety young people, and it just kind of spiraled onwards from that, through meeting people and collaborating, and put a lot of effort and time into improving my own understanding, but also helping other young people understand how all these things intersect. But very much my activism early on was much more climate focused, because I suppose my career is ecology. So it felt like I could volunteer in climate and work in biodiversity, and I can kind of cover all bases that way. But now I can't do quite so much because I'm in the last year of my PhD, a bit stressed, but I still try and help out and kind of guide other little projects now and again. So that's how I got into climate activism.
Thank you so much. Okay, Martin, for my question for you is, can you share examples of how the communities you've worked with are adapting to climate change, or just communities around the world?
I can give you examples of how they're not. You know, because I work in the Himalayas, you know, and you know, as you kindly pointed out, in sort of about 2019 through to 2021, we held a Scottish Parliament inquiry into climate change in the Himalayas. And, you know, one of the problems about climate change is not what it does, it's what it releases. You know, the Tibetan Plateau region, for example, is, you know, a lot of people kind of think of it as a bit like Moldova, but it's not. It's 1 million square miles at the center of Asia, 4,000 meters high. If you consider the mountain ranges around it, you're talking about 2 million square miles. So it's about the size of Europe. You know, one end of the Tibetan Plateau, if you start in Peshawar and you go to Chengdu, and that's on either side, it's the distance between Galway and Istanbul. Okay, just to give you a sense of that. And it's 4,000 meters high. And the effects of climate change under circumstances like that are ones that change the entire Asian continent, because all of the water river sources come out of there. They emerge out of water cycles which are transforming and degrading and accelerating is probably the better way to put it. They're accelerating rather rapidly, and they will affect a whole range of regions around there. So there is a kind of, there's a little bit of a, I'm not going to call it a myth, but there's a little overconcentration that says that, you know, climate change affects indigenous communities more than it affects other communities. It's not as though climate change goes looking for indigenous communities in order to affect them more. A lot of this is about how we talk about words like indigenous communities. But let me give you a sense of this. One of the most substantial effects that is being released right now is, as I said, an accelerated water cycle. All of you will remember from your geography classes when you were in your mid-teens what a water cycle is, about how kind of heat makes water vapor come off the seas. It is driven by a combination of heat and cold towards cold places, which are usually mountains at the center of large continents, where it falls as ice and snow, and it then trickles down through the year back to the sea. And that's what's called a slow regulated water cycle. The problem with it is, for example, is, let's take the Tibetan Plateau, is the major source of all of the major rivers in Asia. And that trickle function ensures those rivers exist all year round. The Tibetan Plateau passed an average 0 degrees centigrade in 1982. Okay, that's the point at which it moved from being an average of less than 0 to more than 0. Now, this is not a negotiable area. This is the point where ice turns to water. This is the point at which a major destabilization occurs, which is now so deeply entrained that we cannot reverse it. We have put the ice cube out in the sun, and we don't have to make it any hotter, for it effectively, most of the ice on most of what we call the cryosphere, snow, permafrost, ice, glaciers, all of that to degrade dramatically. A couple of years ago, and I've forgotten the name of the place, but it's in Uttarakhand. A mountainside fell off because the underlying permafrost was no longer holding it in place. The side of the mountain was 500 meters long, and about 700 meters wide. And it fell 2,000 meters before hitting the ground. When it hit the ground, the released energy was the same as 15 Hiroshimas. The water flow from that and the ice and vapor flow then just simply walked down through the nearby valleys, through two major dams, several local communities. It walked through the dams like they were made of matchsticks. Those flows were still overturning boats a week and a half later in the Indian Ocean. Okay, so here's how indigenous communities in the upper Himalayas avoid the effects of climate change. They get out of the way. They move from places like Ladakh to places like Jammu. They get out of the high mountains because they're damn dangerous. And actually, most of you, do we have any climbers in the room? Okay, if you read any climbing magazines, international climbing magazines, one of the problems that all climbers around the world have increasingly noticed, and you'll find them in almost all climbing magazines, is that rocks are no longer as reliable as they used to be. That handhold that 3 years ago would take your weight now won't, and you will fall. And that is an effect of climate change. So it's kind of occurring all across the system.
Thank you so much. It's really insightful. So back to you, Eloise. We want to ask, how does your PhD research relate to the impacts of climate change on biodiversity?
So directly, it doesn't, but but it will indirectly. So my PhD is on the dispersal behaviour of goshawks, particularly in Scotland. And for those who don't know, a goshawk is like a medium-sized bird of prey. They used to be native to the UK. We killed them all. We brought them back, and now they're expanding. And they rely very heavily on, well, traditionally, forests. One of the reasons they went extinct here is because we cut down on the forests and we killed them. And now we have forests again, mostly plantations, and we don't kill them quite so often as we used to. We still a bit because they eat game birds. However, they are doing generally well and are expanding. And so in my day-to-day, my PhD is very much looking at GPS data, figuring out where they're going and why, what's influencing their movements, which is very focused. But the wider implication is something that I think is an issue of the biodiversity kind of all around the world, is trying to balance the needs of people and of industry and of biodiversity. In the case of the UK, we have a lot of plantation forest. You can argue if it's good for biodiversity or not. In the meantime, it is here and things do use it. And there's this want from Scotland to have more trees, plant more trees and build up their industry. And there are economic reasons why that would be sensible. There are animals that require it because it's a habitat they use, such as the goshawk, but also pine martins and capercaillies and all the different songbirds. And more so in England and in Scotland, there's also people, particularly post-COVID, really wanting to and realizing nature's still there after COVID and wanting to go out and experience stuff, but then you're going to have maybe an issue of disturbance. And so my PhD is fitting into a sort of wider conversation over, we have these multi-use areas that are required to fulfill the needs of many different beings. And how do we balance that as fairly as possible? And of course, everyone has very different visions of what fairly is, what should be prioritized and what should not. And my PhD, like all PhDs, is fit a tiny little drip of information into what particularly the goshawk needs in that wider system.
Thank you so much. That's very, very, very interesting. So I guess I'll go back to Martin then. We'll do a little back and forth. You talked briefly on the indigenous communities, and so I have kind of a follow-up question. I know you said some of them moved, but can you discuss the role of indigenous knowledge and practices in biodiversity conservation in particular?
Well, okay, I'm going to go slightly off message here because I always remember sort of sitting quite recently, it was about 2022, and I got invited to Dharamsala to speak on climate change. Dalai Lama sort of invited lots of people, and I was sitting outside with several Nepalese journalists and a few Indian journalists, and they were all sitting there kind of going, okay, we've got a captive European academic on the veranda with a cup of coffee. So we're going to nail him down and ask him what on earth the word indigenous seems to mean. Because, the Nepalese guy was like, I'm a Nepalese guy. I don't know how I am meant to even use this word. Okay, so I'm sympathetic, speaking as a is a Tibetan refugee. You're a Tibetan refugee. Are you indigenous or are you not indigenous? I personally do prefer to take a whole human race question to this, because, or more to the point, I'm going to actually just go back on what I said there. A lot of people use the word indigenous to mean people that aren't Western. Whereas, for example, I'm British now. You can probably tell I'm not from Scotland, but I am from the south of England, and apparently I've done the genetic testing. My descendants, my ancestors, never went anywhere. They've just never gone anywhere. Some of their brothers and sisters did, but my lot have just basically been stuck from the south of England. I'm a bit of a offshore because I've come to Scotland, but generally speaking, they've been there for 2,000 years now. So am I indigenous? So I'm a little wary about the term. The real essence of the term, as far as I understand it, is a particular relationship with land. And in that regard, we need to ask the question, not just what do indigenous communities do with land, but what do non-indigenous communities do with land? Overwhelmingly, and this is, I can't explain this in full quite now, but it's a book that I'm just writing at the moment called The Narrowing Path, which is sort of an economic history of the Anthropocene. Overwhelmingly, the tendency of the non-indigenous communities is to treat land as an economic commodity. Okay, to treat land not as a space you live in, not as a field of resources you interact over, but as a commodity like that you can buy and sell. All right, and historically, most of the evidence demonstrates that the tendency to do that follows precisely the patterns of biodiversity loss and climate change. It starts, ironically, I'm British here, but so well, I'll take the fall. Being British English is a gift that keeps on giving. It starts in England in around 1649. And it spreads outwards along with the agricultural and industrial revolutions, which are largely driven by that commodified form. It spreads to Canada and America, where it leads to the breaches of the major treaties with the First Nation communities there. It spreads to India, where it leads to tax reform. It spreads to Australia. All of these things, you get a major changes of economics because of that thing. And that is the thing which largely indigenous communities go, we share land. We live within land. It makes no sense for us to buy and sell it. And that's the big difference.
Thank you so much. That's a very interesting perspective to this conversation. Very nice to hear all those different perspectives. Okay, back to you, Louise. You are passionate about empowering young people to take positive action for climate justice. What advice would you give to art students today?
I think I'm 27 now, and I joined UKYCC when I was 21, maybe started getting more into climate stuff around 18. I would say that not to underestimate how much agency you have, particularly if you're a lot younger. I think sometimes you feel like there's a need of permission or like you're fearful of not doing it right. And that causes a hesitancy and not quite knowing what to do. And maybe if you research more or read more, you need someone to kind of give you permission in order to do something, which is not the case at all. I think there's a wonderful energy in the youth movements. There's, and I've really learned so much, and I'm getting out of it now. I'm aging out of it, as you naturally do. So at the moment, I take more of a kind of backseat big sister role and making sure everyone's okay. But there's so much energy and agency that you have. And sure, one of the main issues the youth movement generally doesn't have is money or traditional power, but there's such a desire for collaboration and rethinking things and exploration and self-teaching and self-reflection that creates a very dynamic and creative movement, which I think has a lot of energy and potential in, and therefore not to underestimate your own personal contributions into this. That being said, I think it's also highly recommended to be part of a group. Individual action only takes you so far. You can really learn more and scale action and your energy much more effectively with some kind of collaboration. And then on top of that, don't worry too much about maybe the 10% you disagree with someone else in the climate movement. I've had to do a lot of media speaking throughout the years on this, and one very common thing that would happen would be someone from the BBC or Radio 4 would say, oh, well, this young person or this youth group or this climate movement, they're doing this, but you're doing that, to try and create some kind of internal conflict. And at least at UKYCC, we were very intentional not to tear apart other climate movements, even if we agree like that's not our strategy, but it didn't mean it wasn't valuable. Everyone has different skills and slightly different perspectives, and most of us all recognize what the common enemy and the problem is, and therefore kind of focusing on, okay, where do you find energy? What skills can you contribute, and what elements do you find really interesting? I think is more effective than potentially arguing with your neighbor who generally agrees with everything you're doing, but maybe you disagree on that 10%. And that's the climate crisis is such a multifaceted problem. It's going to require incredibly complex and multifaceted solution, of which yourselves cannot do all of them. And so again, I think trying to find the niche and element that really that you find really interesting and kind of can keep going to in this constant uphill battle that we're all in is probably the most useful thing to do, because this is the rest of our lives, guys. Like this, the climate crisis is happening. It will get worse, even if we make all the CO2 stop right now. It will get worse. There's going to be sort of feedback loops and delays. And so what we're fighting for right now is deciding how bad it's going to be. And therefore, ensuring there's also an element of sustainability in your own action is very important. And that, I think, is one thing I have seen negatively in the youth movement is you get people coming in and doing everything as much as possible and sort of burning out like bright stars, where it's all and nothing, because they recognize the desperation of I think the true severity of the crisis, because for many young people we're not jaded yet. It's not, oh, it's the way it's always been. It's like, no, we're inheriting a dying planet and I'm unhappy about it and you want to fix it. But ensuring that there is some moments of rest and sustainability, again, which is why it's helpful to be part of a group, because when you're tired, ill, exams, I don't know, moving home for the first time, or the kind of elements, significant life events that you're trying to kind of line up with the impending doom of the world, it's very helpful, I think, to know that your peers are still working to give you permission to rest. And so that when you have energy and sort of the mental headspace to be dealing with this, someone else can also take a break. And therefore, again, you're putting sustainability into the practice itself of your activism.
Thank you so much for that wonderful advice. It is really inspiring, and for us, all of us here at the Climate Assembly to hear. And it gives us a lot of hope. Like you said, as in a dying world, it gives us hope and inspiration to continue forward with movements like the climate assemblies and everything else. So thank you so much for that insight and advice. I think we'll have one final question for Martin, and that would be, how do cultural beliefs and practices influence environmental sustainability? And I believe you already kind of talked about this, but is there anything you would like to add?
I do. Again, I'm going to, flip the question a bit, which is really annoying of me. Because, I mean, from my own perspective, I'm not 27. I'm 57. And for me, this has been a long game. I read Limits to Growth when I was 9, all right, in 1974. And Limits to Growth and the MIT Rome reports on climate change presented a series of pictures which have yet to be falsified to a large extent in terms of the long view of what would happen in climate change. And you can get kind of, and so I've sat there for most of my life. I don't drive. I don't have a driving license, because when I was 19, I realized that that was a stupid thing to start. Okay, so I still don't drive, and I still don't have a driving license, much to the annoyance of my wife, by the way, who does. And what's been interesting is, from an anthropological perspective, it's looking at the cultural practices actually not of the communities that are doing the right thing, but of the community that's doing the wrong thing. Let's ask a question, and you'll excuse my French. Why do we continue to fuck this up? Okay? Why is it, despite the fact that we know all of these things, and we have known them for really, to a large extent, 150 years. You'll probably have all seen that famous newspaper article from New Zealand 100 years ago that actually sits there and says, this is all going to happen. Okay? And we have known this all this time. We know that it's happening. We know why it's happening, and we know what is happening, and we know, largely speaking, what the consequences are. What is it about human cultural thought, and or if it's cultural or if it's hardwired, there's a terrifying thought, that causes us to be unable to answer this problem? You know, we managed the ozone layer. That was actually pretty rational, pretty straightforward. The people that really kicked that one off were Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, for crying out loud. All right? They were the ones that pushed that one to get it sorted. Okay? So where have we gone wrong? Now, actually studying that question is, I think, our most urgent climate change question. It's not about the world outside. It's not about nature. It's not about all this. It's about us. It's about why, for example, in the last 3 years, there has been a dramatic shift the other way against a series of accepted protocols on climate change and things on those lines. So I think understanding that puzzle, what is it at the heart of us that we refuse to give up? And answering that question, I think, is the essence of the issue.
Thank you so much. This has been lovely, both of you. I think we're going to have just a quick little Q&A session that'll open up to the floor, and I'll also moderate. So let me turn around here. If you have a question, just raise your hand and tap the thing on the mic, and we'll get that all sorted.
Hello. So you said, just because I wrote something down, about, we were just saying how there's been like a shift in the last couple of years, maybe in the way people think about things that was previously accepted about climate change. That's something I've been thinking about a lot as well, like recently. Why do you think that might be? Do you think it's largely tied in with political stuff that's been going on recently in the world, or possibly people's opinions post-COVID, or what's your views on that?
Okay. Yes, I think there's a ton of politics to this. For example, the way in which the Western world sees climate change as global has been constructed in terms of a series of political organizations, which I like, don't get me wrong, like the IPCC. I like the IPCC, but the IPCC give a certain shape to climate change and biodiversity loss, which is not agreed with by indigenous communities, which to a large extent, arguably, I would argue, and certainly lots of other people would argue, stands in the way of our ability to solve these problems. And it is politically formed. In other words, there has been an agreement on the international stage that the IPCC has to do their job a certain kind of way, because there is a politics to this, and the politics to this are deceptive. Sorry, I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but let's give an example. Most people in this room would probably think that the Trump government does not believe in climate change. Yes? All the evidence demonstrates that they really do. Okay? In 2019, they did a memorandum of understanding with a joint hyperspectral survey of the Greenland ice sheet as to what was underneath it in the wake of total ice loss. From a mineral perspective, they discovered a huge quantity of rare earth metals and everything on those lines. The and Pompeo's State Department produced this, and it is available on their website. It was easy peasy. It was straight and there. All right. And they went, okay, so we want Greenland, which was one of the major reasons, because it provides rare earth metals, and rare earth metals are available in very few places in the world, the other major place being within China and a few bits in Australia. Okay. Similarly, many of the early Trump government's plans for the northern Arctic were predicated on the idea that it would become ice-free and would allow transport links to northern Russia, where ports are being built. Okay, so here's the thing. They understood climate change. They just didn't agree with the Paris Accord. But we in our heads kind of go, oh, you either like Paris or you don't believe in climate change. Well, that's not true. It is a choice, and it's a political choice about creating, in the last, particularly I think in the last few years, this is the major shift, creating a large-scale resource hinterlands around three major power blocks, China, Russia, and the US. And to a certain extent, India is trying to get in there, and Europe's not. But creating that major hinterland to ensure that in a climate change world, those polities will survive has become a very dominant force against the kind of global internationalism that preceded it. That's the major shift that has occurred. And it's not about what happens really on the ground. That's about realpolitik. So yeah, biggie there.
I'm just going to add a teeny bit on, and then yeah, next question. Yes, and I think maybe from a more community level perspective or peer-to-peer perspective, thinking particularly UK national, if you have a group, a population that is very stressed about immediate concerns, so things like cost of living crisis, housing, maybe remnants still from the COVID days and things like that, it's very, very hard to motivate someone to change and add extra stress into their day-to-day behaviors when your immediate needs aren't being met. The climate crisis feels for a lot of people in the West quite existential. I mean, it's feeling increasingly felt in Europe. We know it's already massively felt on the human level across the world, but naturally where we are, we're a bit behind. And also we have infrastructure that can kind of mitigate it a little bit. But that's also something I think I've been quite conscious of when I've done more, community level activism, is that you sometimes it's sometimes a bit of a privilege to then take the time to consider and to make changes, and things like choosing not to drive. That works if someone else can drive you, but also that you have transport and infrastructure that allows you to get around, or that you have internet to be able to have access to lots of other places and to have communications. So there is, at the top level, it's massively political. Like COP is a mess. It's an awful place to be and watch happen. But if in a more community level, bearing in mind that if you have people who already have very in their face crises that they're personally dealing with, they're not going to want to talk to, care, or change their behavior, or consider how much more they're going to have to change and lose in order to accommodate a crisis that feels quite far away. And you can handle that, but it's something that I think requires some sort of sensitivity and tact in your communications.
Earlier, what are your thoughts on kind of the Lynn White Jr. school of thought about the relation of the perspectives on climate change and land?
I have no idea. Sorry, you're going to have to unpack that for me a little bit.
No, Lynn White Jr. was an American scholar who was kind of one of the first major voices criticizing the anthropocentrism of Christianity and how, compared to other religions such as, to use the buzzword, Native American populations, indigenous Asian populations, and how they interact with land, claiming his particular claim was that Christianity uniquely focuses on human needs and therefore the use of land as a commodity, rather exemplified by how the Americans exploited American land and the European colonialism.
Okay, now I remember the Lynn Whiting question. Thank you for reminding me, actually. I have to say, I enjoy those kinds of arguments. I always remember reading Schumacher's Buddhist economics, for example, and stuff like that as to the solution to the problem. And there is this argument that kind of places it, firmly in a kind of Judeo-Christian perspective, stewards of the earth kind of thing, the separation of humankind from the rest of creation, things on those lines. I was convinced by those arguments for a long time, and I am no longer convinced by those arguments. I think the arguments are, I think the things that are driving things now, I think there are some implications there. In particular, the argument about the separation of humankind from the rest of nature, which exists within the climate change movement. You know, E.O. Wilson's Half Earth, you know, we'll just have half human race will live on this side and nature can live on that side, for example, is a classic example of that. So yes, it has an influence. The argument that says human beings are just bad for nature is precisely that kind of argument. Human beings are stewards of nature, you know, is those kinds of arguments. So does it have an impact? Yes, it certainly does. Is it the driving force behind the physical processes we're talking about? I don't think so. I'm less convinced by that. You have to have an explanatory system that says, how does biodiversity loss occur in those circumstances? And that's about things like marshland loss. That's things like infrastructure, transport infrastructure development, and those kind of theological arguments. They don't have an explanation for that link. So there we go.
Hello. I have a question for both of you, but I would like to take a minute to introduce myself. My name is Lakpa Tundub, and I'm a Tibetan refugee in Nepal. I was born in Nepal, but my parents fled from Tibet under Chinese occupation. And today's climate assembly is on biodiversity. And the place that I grew up, the Tibetan refugee settlement, it borders Tibet. And I've seen the change in biodiversity. For instance, the settlement is called Namgiling, and it's really cool there because it's near Tibet borders, and there's a lot of mountain ranges. But the last time I visited, I found that there are now mosquitoes there. Like nobody in that place has ever heard of mosquitoes. Now that you have to buy those mosquitoes repeller to keep mosquitoes away. And another thing that I noticed is while growing up there, I remember we used to have those white big cranes, and my grandfather and grandmother would tell me that those birds are from Siberia and they would go to Tibet in the winter, or I don't remember this season, but those birds would visit us in the field, and we would chase them away as a kid, and it used to be really lovely to see those big birds landing on our fields. And the last time when I went there, I learned that those birds hasn't visited us in, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And I have seen the change in the climate, like I've lived it. And my question to both of you is, I am a refugee, but I'm in the UK now. And I feel empowered, but I feel powerless at the same time. Like what would you, it is a very selfish question, but how would you, I want to know what would be the best for me to challenge or help to this cause?
So, tricky question because it depends on so many things. So there are sort of different levels you can engage with like the climate crisis, and there is like a very individual level which we all usually start out move away from quickly. Like there's not much you can do there for too long. There's the more community level stuff with your peers in your local area. Of course, this is slightly different for you. You're having a different perspective. There's maybe national levels where you're going to have groups, maybe, and this is some of what I've done to pretty much every level at this point. There's national groups where you try and engage with policymakers and you convince them that, hey, you should negotiate better on these things, or try and sway political things by trying to tell people, we really care about this. This is really important. We will vote for you if you do this thing and change. And you challenge the kind of, and rely on hopefully a sensible democratic process to try and get those things through. Above that, that's when you start having IPCC and you have the Conference of Parties where all the countries come together and try and negotiate sort of the big overarching guidances for all the world. And then hopefully you negotiate well there, come up with good, sensible plans, and you go back to your country and try and implement them. At every level, there's a problem. There's different pros and cons to all of it. And so part of it is why I struggle to answer is like, which element do you think you find the most interesting or engage with? I've been to COP, and there is some multiple times now, and there is something very cool and flashy about having all these different politicians and people running around. Oh, look, there's Nancy Pelosi. I'll shout at her. Like, there's lots of fun things going on, but you at the same time know you're doing so little. Like, the amount of energy our campaigns put into and the amount of money that we have to pull together to get there, and you know you're moving things a millimeter, and you're part of a tiny drop in a much bigger, complicated oceans of people also on your side, but so many people against you. And sometimes you leave feeling like, well, what was that for? The amount of passion that you put into it. And there is an emotional load to all of this as well. But it's the biggest scale, so you feel like it should be important. At the community level, some like things like this, we know on the big stage it's not doing much, but there's a human connection element that's really fulfilling, and there's some things that is very fulfilling. And you know that, okay, well, I've met these people, I've interacted with them, and hope that my care and hope and passion will kind of ricochet through the community and will start influencing other people that they go by, and have a sort of like butterfly effect going out. And I've done all of them, and at different points I've liked more than others. So part of it is very much for you. If you're interested in like the UK national level, then looking to the big charities that maybe are already doing work on that. A lot of big charities also have youth branches to have that kind of more urgent youth angle that's generally lacking. But if none of them appeal to you, you can also start your own, which of course has its own kind of time burden as well. So that's probably not that helpful, but.
I mean, one thing is a point that Eloise has already made, which is that as the conditions of your life change, the precise emphases that you put forward will change. And there are different things you can do at different moments in your life. I have a garden. I'd love to call it a garden. It's kind of like a forest because we haven't done much of it. But one of the things, like Scotland, for example, has a very quickly denuding sparrow population. All right, the sparrows are going, but we have about 150 in our garden most days because we create a little oasis for it. And I can do that because I've got a mortgage and I'm a landowner. All right, and that's for a certain stage in life. At an earlier stage in life, I was doing things like not driving and so forth. So there are different things for different moments in your life, and I'd absolutely agree with that one. I think on the larger political scale, the environmental, I'll be blunt here, the environmental movement has been hampered by the way in which it thinks about climate change. In particular, it remains rather focused on mitigation, whereas its most substantial conservative political impact would be on adaptation and disaster relief. If you could find out, because it's the hard bit, if you could find out what's going to happen to the northeast of Scotland over the next 50 years, what's going to happen to the Dee River and the Don River, what's going to happen to Ballater and Bankery and Aberdeen, what's going to happen when the cycle of long dry summers and heavy rainy mud-clagged winters begins to actually really impact our infrastructure, because it already is actually, and that's a major shift even the 25 years I've been here. If you think about those and say, well, how do we respond to those in terms of adaptation forms? How do we respond, if you're in Cornwall, to increased storm seasons? And think about it more in that sense of saying, look, because most of the patterns of feedback effects are already in place. They're either in the system and coming our way, and we can't stop them, or they're overt and coming our way, and we can't stop them. So there's a huge range of things. So adaptation is actually a major direction. I often got frustrated by people that didn't use, sorry, it's going to sound Machiavellian, use adaptation as the primary discussion rather than mitigation. Oh, we need to stop this for some future event. No, these things are happening right now. And if climate change activists were prepared to, for example, build storm walls and things on those lines, then I think the movement would have far more credibility than its presence rather sidelined and marginalized position. I don't mean that as a criticism of the idea of the movement itself. It's just there is a problem. We're not facing it. I think one of the issues is having thought about it for a long time. It's in the future. We're going to worry about that. I'm going to worry about my old age. No, worry about right now and help people adapt to it. Because if you want allies, that's how you get allies.
How do I, as an individual, do that?
Well, the first thing you need to do is, I mean, and I go back to my point about the IPCC. Let me explain that point very quickly. The IPCC talks about climate change as global. So if you actually are the sort of person that, like me, actually sits down and reads, so, you know, these 23 volumes of the latest version, one of the things they do is they say, they divide it up by the science. So you have a book that kind of goes marines, seas, and then it's ice, and then it's mountains, and then it's things on those lines. So one of the things it doesn't do is say, what happens when all of those, that weather effect, the change in the cryosphere, the change in water flows occur and combine in the northeast of Scotland? Now, actually, this is one of the things we were trying to do in the report on the third pole region around the Tibetan Plateau. What happens when all of these things combine? What happens in Kham and Amdo, which is where your family's from, when the glaciers are melting because of extra heat, atmospheric heat, but so is the permafrost layer, which acts as a shield and because ice is waterproof, it keeps rainwater close to the surface, so you have grasslands. And one of the things that they found, for example, the Chinese found is, oh, climate change is occurring, the glaciers are melting, but the land is desertifying, and there's less water. And they were sitting there going, where is this going? And they eventually did the thing that most development 101 people do, and they looked at it and they went, it must be because of irrational land use by the local nomads. So we'll get rid of them all from an area the size of France. They emptied it because that was the answer. But the real problem was when glaciers melt in a place where there is permafrost, the water from it just goes very deep. And that water leaves the surface, so you can't have your grasslands, so it's desertified. All right. Now, that combination of knowledge in one place is something that the IPCC don't do. They'll say, let's look at glaciers melting in the Alps. Let's look at them melting in Norway. Let's look at melting in the Himalayas. They don't put it all together. And there are good reasons for that. And those are long ago agreed political reasons, which is saying what will happen to the US or to Britain in entirety is effectively a discussion of its economic future, and it's a national security issue. You can actually find out, roughly speaking, what's going to happen to most of Britain. The Met Office provide they do actually cut it up into little bits, but they provide their most comprehensive data to the Royal Horticultural Society. So they're the people to ask.
Just maybe one very quick thing to add on to your emphasis of like, what can you do individually? I was thinking, okay, what all the stuff I've done, how I've got into it, where would I start? And there's very few things that I can think of that I can say I did that as an individual. I think the most I can say is that I probably managed sort of by accident to turn some of my friends vegan by just existing in their proximity, but all like my bigger achievements, quote unquote, have been part of teams. And when I present these things, I try and talk, I want to emphasize that I'm but a cog in a lovely machine of lots of other people. And I think of the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis more like a chessboard of like, there's lots of groups all playing their roles on opposite sides. And my contribution is to a particular piece, but I'm not individually a piece on this whole board. There's in a place where this chessboard analogy works very well is at COP. So UKYCC is a youth group that have gone to the last, I think, 16 like climate COPs or so. Youth groups, so there's turnover, it's not the same people, but it has a lot of institutional knowledge of how they work and a lot of campaigns they build on over time. Because we go, then we make collaborations and keep an eye on the other youth groups that are coming in with different campaigns and angles. Because if they're doing something we can easily support, we'll support them. If they can support us, can you share this thing? We then also then pay attention to what this civil society and COP kind of work in the better, like unions, kind of. So we hear, okay, so there's Younger, which is like the Youth and Universities Union, and then you're going to have Ringo, which is the researchers. Then you have women, that's just their name, and we pay attention to all the different groups and what their main kind of emphasis and concerns and criticisms or supports are. And then let's say we go to the UK negotiator, be like, hi, you have this stance, we don't like it, we want you to say this instead. And then we've also gone around and tried to convince people from the women's representatives or the farmers' representatives or the research to also go to negotiator to also criticize the same thing that we're criticizing. And that's kind of how we shift the negotiators' stances. So we're a group, but we're also working with all other groups coming from the angles because we know our argument. For example, the last few COPs, we've been campaigning on the issue of conflict of interests in COP because there isn't any kind of policy on how to deal with conflict of interest at the COP level for various reasons, but it is an issue. And so then we've internally been trying to make this an issue for other groups to like, hey, it's this really big thing, guys, you should all pay attention to this. And then if they come across certain negotiators, we're like, could you mention it to them, please? Thank you. We can tell this guy because also you can't meet everyone. So a lot of collaboration is happening to cause these shifts. A lot of communication internally and sharing thoughts and opinions and stances happen a lot, but it's all part of a big team. And my individual contribution is maybe me grabbing a certain negotiator because I saw them on the side of the room and a quick spill I could give to them and got an email address. But then someone else has successfully found food for us and stay in the queue for like half an hour so we could all eat somewhere and fill up a water bottle. So there's, again, this big network of people helping in lots of different ways. And it's very rarely ever an individual. You can rarely go for like, I did this and made this change because it's such a big scale of an issue.
So, sorry, that's gonna wrap our Q&A up, and we're going to go into a short 10-minute break, and then we'll go on to the breakout activity. Thank you so much to our speakers for their discussion. And thank you so much to everyone who asked questions. It was a lovely conversation. So enjoy the break.
I need a
I
copy.
think you just plug it in.
Okie dokie.
Thank you. Hi guys, I think we're gonna have to get going. I think the speakers are welcome to stay or to leave. I think we'll take a quick group photo now before the speakers leave. Eloise, sorry. Right, guys, we're gonna move on to the breakout groups. So this is the exciting bit where you're gonna have your say. Remember that all the information that we collect at the assemblies, we are providing it to the university so that they can implement some changes with your feedback. And also we're sending it to the city council too. So make sure to make the most out of these sessions, say everything you have to say. Bye, Louise. So yeah, we are going to start, we're gonna have a 20-minute breakout session on climate change. I need to adapt the times a bit more, but we'll start with climate change. So we're gonna be, as last time, we're gonna be a one big group. If anyone doesn't feel very comfortable speaking, we're gonna be providing some post-it notes if you just want to write it down instead and just paste it on the flip chart. So I'll give you guys some paper here. And basically we've prepared two scenarios here. One more related to the general climate change and the other one more focused on biodiversity. So we're gonna start with the climate change one. I'll give you a paper and this is your scenario. Imagine that there's an extreme winter storm that caused flooding and extreme winds in Aberdeen and on campus. So what would be affected? What would be the consequences of that extreme event? And how would you make campus more resilient, including Hillhead, the medical campus, etc.? So I'll give you guys a paper. You're welcome to like join and leave the bed if you want. Answer any. But you're welcome to also chill. Okay, so we got Julia. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
I think I've got a first thought, especially to do with extreme winter storms and extreme winter winds. Um, I think I remember with George Street, like the second major street I call it for Aberdeen, they had some of their like oldest trees ripped out of the ground. So I think one way that we definitely see some effects is just again some more trees being ripped out of the ground, and I don't think the winds are getting any slower recently. When there is like an actual extreme wind event, it is pretty bad. I remember like some months ago we had like 2 or 3 in 2 months with all different names. So I think the first thing that would happen is that trees again would be uprooted because like the ones recently that I've seen have been very strong.
There was like lots of trees falling over and like floods and stuff. So that would be a thing. Yes.
2022, we had Storm Arwen. Storm Arwen turned over 7 million trees in the northeast of Scotland. I have to say my household actually has had winter heating from fallen trees for 3 years after Storm Arwen, because we just went out, chopped stuff up and took it back to our house. But that was, the damage was largely because climate change had affected the storms. Storms normally come to the northeast of Scotland from the southwest. They come up across the Pennines, and it protects the northeast of Scotland because most of it is dumped on the Pennines. Then it hits the Grampians, and by the time it gets to us, it isn't that bad. Storm Arwen came from the north. Now, trees, when they grow, their roots are like muscles, okay? The more you pull on a muscle, the bigger the muscle gets. That's why we go to the gym, right? And similarly, trees that are pushed from the south by the wind develop stronger roots in the south side. And the trees in the northeast of Scotland all had the big roots on the southwest side. And so when the Storm Arwen came from the north, it knocked them all over. And we lost millions of trees. There was a massive deforestation that occurred here. So we have actually seen one of these quite recently. It was only, that's 3 years ago. So they're a very real thing.
There was a major storm, can't remember the name of it, but it hit sort of Stirling area and caused lots of flooding in Stirling city centre. And there was like people who were like surfing down the streets and stuff. I just did a project on it for class, but yeah. Storm X was one of the ones that was mentioned, but I can't remember if it was Storm X entirely.
I mean, one of the things we're seeing here is more storm fronts and wind fronts coming from the north, coming down from the polar regions. You can actually see them in the winter months because you get the nacreous clouds that look like kind of pools of petrol, multicolored. And in my lifetime, I never saw one of those before 2019. And now they're almost every year because the cold winters, because the polar, circumpolar cell is destabilizing, and more of it is heading down towards us. That is heard most of the time since about 2009 when there was a major shift.
In terms of like
So 2020, the 2020 crash was because of heavy weather outside Stonehaven, where those 3 people died. 2 of whom I knew. And that was, we almost lost our railway line to the south. And actually there was considerable discussion even in the city council here about what happens if we actually lose the railway line for an entire winter. What would happen to the city's economy and things on those lines, because, you know, we depend on that, and exactly the same thing that causes a railway line to disappear will render Dice Airport unusable for a shorter period of time, admittedly, but it's still it's a significant problem. There are plans that are in place. 1967. In 1967, the city was quarantined because of a typhoid outbreak. They actually had to close. You couldn't come here, and there were actually army around the city. Apparently, it was a can of bad beef from Argentina, and it was infected with typhoid, and there was a big party, and lots of people got typhoid, and it began to spread within the local population, and they actually quarantined the entire city, and food was brought in by helicopter and things on those lines. So we have protocols for them. There's a lovely bit in the radio at the time. The doctor that was in charge of it, he sort of said, was somebody, I can't remember, it was a BBC reporter, and he said, and why do you think so many people were affected? And he said, oh, it was from Edinburgh. Makes a difference. He said, well, there aren't many cities in Scotland where you can get 42 slices out of a single can. So it's a little joke about the Aberdonians that they're a little miserly. But no, there are protocols, but they're kind of old. But yeah, no, a lot of this is.
I mean, like the train thing as well, that stretch of line where there was a derailment, it's also got really bad network, like really bad network connections. So anyone calling emergency.
Well, that's why they had to climb up way up the mountain to get it to say that there had been a crash. Also, by the way, that thing fills up.
What?
Oh, the tower.
Yeah, no, it filled up in 2020 that year. It really, really rained a lot. And you see where the tower is. You can see the line underneath the tower. So there's basically a balcony in there, and it's about that deep, and it completely filled up with water. And the stones of the crown began to be pushed out, which actually threatened the entire thing collapsing. It's like it would have destroyed the church and everything on those lines. They had to get up there. Myself and Ryan over in theology were actually watching them, and they had to get a big spike, push it up through the drains to let the water out, because the thing almost collapsed on us. So yes.
Houses are kind of below ground and like open up.
Yes.
How's the drainage of those? Because I've wondered about it every time it like dumps snow or rains heavily. How's the drainage in those things?
Not good. I live in a house in outside of Scotland. It's an airship. It's an old house. It's no Scotland's station master. And yeah, our house has had to have repairs, and whenever things have to go when there's damage, and my mum calls in the insurance people, it's always a kind of sigh of this in an old house, and the drainage is not great.
Especially in winter, isn't it like a hazard for elderly people trying to get up?
Absolutely, it's hazard for them. It's a big concern. My mom's geriatrician, and she works with a lot of people who are struggling with their houses and stuff, because when it rains hard, they are completely trapped. They can't get out and do anything. So,
follow-up question: does Aberdeen have any storm drains? I don't seem to have seen any.
What, sorry?
storm drains. I don't think the historical weather has really made it a necessity to build them, but it seems to be getting to a point where it might be a good investment.
The real question is whether or not the North Atlantic circulating current changes. You know, that's the big climate change question for Scotland, which is if that current that comes up from the tropics and warms the UK and Ireland, if that destabilizes, there's a lot of stuff on. There are Norwegian teams working on that at the moment, and give you a sense of this because this is something I pay attention to. Because in the 1970s they talked about it a lot, and there was a prospect that there would be global freezing in the North Atlantic, which is, by the way, still a possibility. Later on, kind of went, I thought you said there was global warming, or were we freezing? Which is it? You know, and the scientists had to go, we actually don't know, because this is a chaotic system and it can leap one way or it can leap another way. And if that circulating current gets affected by basically ice water shutting it down, really it becomes impossible to live here.
So I know, I think based on this question and just some of what you talked in your there now, the resilient part might actually be a bit harder, whereas we should probably just make sure we have plans for adaptations in the coming future. So like I said, it might lead into the local government and river dredging, but also just students and seats just having signs for them in terms of their storm events, certain things you shouldn't be doing or be aware of and stuff. So I think
I mean, the Norwegian lot, you know, when I first heard about that, I was, so that was in the 70s, they were like, this is 5,000 years away. And we're all like, great. And then when I started reading the papers again in 2015, they were like, this is 300 years away. And the latest papers coming out of Tromsø are saying 25 years. And I'm like, excellent. I'm so glad I'm 57.
Right, guys, we're gonna have to move on to the next one. So the next scenario is, what would happen to our city if bees suddenly disappeared? What would be affected? What would be the consequences? And what can be done in Aberdeen and on campus to ensure conservation of our species?
Was that good, Julia?
Hi, yeah. Yeah, you typed something in the chat.
Yeah, Julia, I just read it out. Sorry, we wasn't on the mic when we was talking about it. But yeah, everybody's aware of the brilliant points you put down.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Like, I mean, they did a very impressive one just in front of the science teaching hub last spring. But I've definitely had conversations with the uni, and they're like, oh, but like it's very precious to keep our lawns like this for like visual, you know, and like the perspectives and attracting students and stuff. But we got so many lawns on campus. Surely we can turn a few.
I mean, during the Second World War, Elphiston Lawn was converted to allotments, as was the entirety of Seaton Park. You know, and that was okay at that point in time, because the university was kind of a little short on 18 to 25-year-olds. All right, they were all off going to be dying in a war somewhere. So you know, it's certainly something. Of course, it's something that can. You know, all of these things are unrealistic.
Can I ask why New Kings is the only building with that many plants in and around it?
Just which.
New Kings. Can I ask why New Kings is like the only building with that many plants on and around it? It has. Yeah. I think what I heard was that they let the horticulture students go at it or something.
Yeah, in like in the Cruikshank garden. But that's inside Cruikshank, and it's like the school plant, so I can't remember what actually.
Is there any reason we don't do that to the others?
That's a question we can pose to our outcomes.
And McRobert.
Yeah.
Just completely make them way more pretty.
Yeah. No, I mean New Kings is like one of the attractions.
To grow allotments and plants, things like that. Find Edward Wright. There's a little kind of banked area, which is locked off, and we started doing that during the late pandemic. We didn't kind of get rid of it, you know, but it was meant to kind of actually be effectively sloped allotments with tiers and things of those lines. We just couldn't get hold of the relevant labor supplies and expertise supplies amongst ourselves. Guys from the States wouldn't help us, but they were like, you can do it if you like.
That would actually be a good, like, sort of joint project, like to finish the allotment.
We found a piece of lawn that was actually quite big, right on towards the right side of it's King's College. No, yeah, it's actually just there, and it was amazing, and it's just a lawn. Like that could be turned into, and it was really sunny as well. Like it would be perfect for allotments.
Oh, yeah, at the corner with the University Road. So yeah, actually that. Plus, as well, there's an abandoned tennis court, so that could potentially be converted into more space for gardens, or it could just be refurbished.
You could have
back
raised beds
into
in it.
another tennis court. Yeah.
Raised beds would probably be easiest.
Yeah, and since it's directly behind the like what I think it's like the divinity and philosophy, the DHPA school office, like
That's there.
yeah, like there.
College Grounds.
Yeah, that like Ali, I think there's I think I saw even a kitchen space next
Do
to
people not
it.
play tennis on the tennis courts?
Yeah.
They do. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, but there's one that's just been overgrown by moss.
Well, you got that other one up by Hill Head as well.
That one's also overgrown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Because I used to live in it like 3-4 years ago, and I never saw anyone.
Because you cannot tell it was a tennis court.
No, I
That's how
didn't,
bad
but
it is.
like, this was like from where I'm from.
One last question. What do you guys think of like green walls and green roofs on buildings?
I like them, but they require a lot of money because it often, yeah. So, but your green roofs and things like that, I like them, and I really think they would be cool. But they would, a lot of these buildings are really old, and you'd have to literally take the roof and completely redo it, and probably some of the walls and great infrastructure inside the building as well. So that's a massive undertaking, massive project with a lot of money. So I hate to say realistically, but changes like that, it would just take a lot to do. But I definitely think that, they're great, but take a lot, a lot. Yeah. Yeah, you basically do. Especially, recently in recent years, I don't know how much RAC impacts this university, but it was a big thing in the news, and I know Dundee Uni had massive issues with RAC. Um, yeah, it actually would be that there's all those things to take into consideration. A lot of these buildings were not built to have extra pressure put on those roofs, which is also a problem with increasing climate. Is that you're saying historic buildings are not made for major changes, and that includes green roofs.
You've also got two problems with, firstly, accessibility, because I know that I said that New Kings should be made an example of, but the other problem with New Kings is that during the spring semesters, they're kind of a nightmare for students with bee allergies. So if you do increase the bee population on campus, that creates an issue for any students who have insect allergies or bee venom allergies. But the other issue with green walls and green roofs is that there's not always, it takes a lot of expertise and management to ensure that with a building as old as you said, that root penetration doesn't happen and destabilize them.
Just as a point on the bee allergy thing, it's a funny kind of thing. When I was a kid, and you drove anywhere in the UK, you had your windscreen wipers on most of the time once you were out of the city, because your windscreen was completely covered in insects all the time, and they were constantly spat, 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 spat. All right, and you had to kind of wipe clear. You can now drive, basically speaking, all the way to London without having to do that on a dry day now. That is the degree of insect loss that has occurred in the UK in one lifetime. And controversial here, some people have argued that it is actually the loss of things like bees being stung when you're young and everything on those lines, which contributes to the allergy thing. But then, but the real thing is just to understand how denuded UK is and how comparatively recent a lot of that is. It's not stuff that was done 200 years ago. It's stuff that I've witnessed in my lifetime.
I mean, yeah, even in the past 10 years, like there's been that thing, like even like 5-10 years ago, you could drive and it would occasionally happen where an insect would splat on the windscreen, but it's just almost never now.
That's actually a method that BugLab uses to measure biodiversity, but it's by counting the amount of insects that are on the plate, what do you call it, like the car plate, the registration vehicle. Yeah, so they count the amount of insects. I don't think, maybe they can identify it, I don't know, but they're quite squished, I guess. Oh,
Luckily, unified exists. Although it doesn't do much, it makes it a bit more.
Yeah, plus as well, it shows like even now, like with all the decline in biodiversity, there's still so much that rather like that you still have all like the chronic like reaction.
Right, guys, we really need to get going. We got a couple of things. We got. Okay, no worries. Thank you, Martin. Thank you. Right, so as always, just a few advertisements. On the 3rd of June, Aberdeen Climate Action are organizing another climate cafe. This time is on, can we make our economic system sustainable? Then on the 4th of June, we have organized a tour of the Zoology Museum, which is going to be led by the Zoology and Biological Sciences Society at the uni. So it's completely free. It'll just be a bunch of us. We'll go there. We'll have the tour, which is actually about the extinction of animals and climate change and everything. And then I think the plan is to go to the Cruikshank Botanic Gardens afterwards, just like have a wander around, and then maybe just look at biodiversity. I'm quite keen on plant ID and mushroom ID as well, so maybe I can give a bit of info. Yeah, and then we're organizing a garden party on the 12th of June. There's a bit of lawn that's just on the left of the Student Union building. We got permission from the grounds team to actually manage that space. So we're planning to kind of like turn it into some sort of garden and outdoor space. And that leads me to what we're gonna be doing tomorrow. Thanks to some of our volunteers, we have built some hedgehog houses. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., if anyone fancies coming along, we're meeting up with the grounds team of the uni, and we're going through campus, placing lots of squirrel boxes, bird feeders, hedgehog houses, bug hotels, and butterfly houses as well, which is really cool, no? So yeah, and then we got lots of other events. So keep an eye out on our website, and you'll definitely see lots of events coming up soon. And then one last thing, I'm just gonna do a bit of promo of the latest David Attenborough's documentary on the oceans. Really cool, definitely recommend it. I can't believe this man probably just released his biggest piece of work when he's 99. Definitely. Oh yeah, one last thing. 2 days ago, an MSP member of the Scottish Parliament emailed me asking if the Students' Union could support this bill, the Ecocide Prevention Scotland bill. So I'm planning to reply to her tomorrow. But if you can let me know your thoughts, maybe. I mean, obviously, like I'm representing the students. So if you let me know your thoughts, whether we should support this bill, whether or not. Long story short, it's basically a bit targeted. It's basically just aiming to create some more repercussions and kind of like turn ecocide into a crime. So those industries and large corporations that really make a really bad, long-lasting impact on the environment, they should be paying a lot of money and also go to jail. So that's basically what this is saying. And I think, I mean, since it's targeted to large corporations and industries who at the moment don't really care about the repercussions just because their profit is way more than kind of like the price they have to pay. They don't care about the environment.
I think the we have to stay with that.
We'll see. We'll have a read and let me know. You can email me. And one last thing, I mean, as always, please give us some feedback. This is the last assembly, so we're going to do a little activity there on your way out. So I'm just asking a couple of questions like, what topics would you like to see in future assemblies? You know, like I'm finishing my role at the Students' Union at the end of June, so I will no longer be here, but hopefully someone else can take on the assembly. So what topics would you like to see? Would you like the assemblies to continue? Which was your favorite assembly? And how did you like these assemblies? And yeah, you can even tell us like, what did you learn? So thank you very much, guys. I hope you have a lovely summer. For those of you that are staying in Aberdeen, hopefully see you around. Come to the events. I'll stay in Aberdeen. Whoever can come tomorrow at 9 a.m., we're meeting outside the Students' Union building. Very fair. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
I don't like reading books. Actually, I don't. So, there's something called suggested reading. And
Do you have compulsory?
no, I'm big on the suggested side of that.
What about compulsory reading? You don't have that?
No, I've never grown up with compulsory. Like, it's suggested.